Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast. That is, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Kate Batchelor-Odell and Kim Strassel, and we're talking about the fiscal showdown between House Republicans and President Biden over the debt ceiling, which should be reached sometime in June, thereabouts. Nobody knows exactly because nobody knows exactly what the pace of revenues will be coming in. But Kim, I wanted to ask you, do you think Biden actually wants a debt crisis in the sense that he wants it to go to the wire, does not want to negotiate with Republicans, will not negotiate with Republicans until we get, if he ever will, to the end where they will claim crisis, 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 default, default, default. We'll get Wall Street and the press echoing that. Stock market will fall. The International Monetary Fund will weigh in. You'll get all kinds of economists on Wall Street fretting. And they figure then the Republicans break apart and run.
Sure, he definitely wants that. And I'm not trying to be a cynic, but first of all, he knows he's going to have everybody on his side. Like you said, the markets will freak out. The media will all be on his side. There will be all this hysteria about how bad things are going to be. But he also has practical reasons for this as well, too. He doesn't want to cut spending, okay? Most of the things that the Republicans are putting forward here would be walkbacks of priorities that he and progressive Democrats have been pushing for the last 2 years. Look, they added $6 trillion worth of spending over 2 years. They want that baked into the cake. They want it there forevermore. Look at the president's most recent budget. It proposes keeping spending not just at current levels, but even higher. He has an increase of $76 billion in discretionary spending in his budget proposal. Also, look, the president doesn't want to look as though he is losing or having to negotiate or bending to the will of Republicans. So he's going to keep going down this path. And as Kate mentioned, McCarthy's got the problem of that entire speaker vote where the Republicans laid out on full display their many divisions and how narrow is their margin. And the White House is probably making a decent bet, at least from historical perspective, that they're going to break apart again. Now, I don't know if I'd bet on it that hard because I do think that McCarthy has understood that this is a risk. He knows that this is the first big test that he is facing of whether or not he can corral his caucus. I find it a little difficult to believe he'd have gone up and given this speech and made a promise he was going to pass something if he didn't feel he had at least a decent shot at getting that done. But we will see in the coming weeks.
Well, this could make or break his speakership, quite frankly.
Absolutely.
A phrase that he used, which I thought was interesting, was the president could, quote, bumble into, unquote, default. That is, by playing a game of brinksmanship, he could overestimate the weakness of the Republican conference, the unity of the Republican conference, and think he can cause them to blink and run. And I think in that case, we could end up, McCarthy says, with some kind of accidental default that nobody wants. Now, my own view is that won't happen because of the point I made earlier about prioritizing debt payments. There's even an argument, you hear it on the right and the left, not a bad argument, that Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, would be violating the law if she doesn't prioritize debt payments. The 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says the validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned, unquote. And the point being that if it looked like there was going to be a fault, she'd have to prioritize those payments. Now, they won't admit that because they want to create the kind of the appearance of a crisis. But I think this is something that if push comes to shove, Yellen may have to do.
Yeah. And Paul, I think McCarthy made a smart play today by really anchoring his case in the broader economic realities. I mean, he talked about how Americans have $7,400 less because of inflation since Biden took office. I think that's a pretty compelling point. And he also, in a really striking statistic, noted that we're supposed to pay $10.5 trillion interest on the debt over the next 10 years, which is more than we paid from 1940 to today in 80 years. So the idea that Biden can just send over a clean debt ceiling and expect to pass it, or just ask Yellen to hold the debt hostage, is not realistic based on the federal budget picture.
All those points are outstanding, and they're correct and excellent to make. I think the problem that House Republicans have is that the American people aren't going to hear any of it because press corps won't report any of it. They will merely report what Biden says, and they'll go over and quote Mark Zandi, the Moody's economist who might as well be on the White House payroll, and basically say, yeah, boy, it's going to be terrible. Default is here, baby, and we'll crash and burn, and Alexander Hamilton is going to be weeping from the heavens because, we have defaulted on our debt if the Republicans don't roll over. I mean, that's what they're going to hear, Kim. And so the question is, can they hold up against that? Stay unified, and then force the president to actually have to sit down and work out what, after all, is not going to be it's not going to be a rollback of his entire agenda by any stretch. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act isn't being repealed. The permitting reform is actually something that he said he wanted in return for Joe Manchin's vote for the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, the details would have to be worked out on how far permitting reform goes, but that is something that would actually help him. Kim.
Yeah, it's so funny what you said about the media, Paul. As we were getting ready to come and talk about this, I went to see what everybody was reporting about McCarthy's speech and couldn't find anything. Nobody was reporting anything on McCarthy's speech. There was a ton of stories about divisions within the GOP caucus and Jim Jordan holding a hearing today in New York because this gets into Trump, but very little about the speaker's message. So I think the Republicans understand this, though. I mean, they have lived a long time with these media games. And the goal is, if you can get across this bill and pass it, send it to the Senate, then there's no choice. It's going to be in the headlines. They can make the case about the very straightforward nature of their ask. Because I agree with you, Paul. These are not wild demands, okay? This is not the Republicans, as the press corps suggested was going to happen, Republicans demanding a balanced budget in 10 years, okay? And that is something that some in the House Freedom Caucus did want to do. They do seem to have landed on a number of modest requests they're going to send up. Again, I was struck by the nature of the fact that they're long and wide, giving them all some negotiating room. And I think that's then the second follow-on step is, let's say McCarthy gets this through, the House sends it to the Senate, it provokes the White House into some sort of negotiation. What then will Republicans settle for?
Crucial point.
That's the bigger question. He might have unity on this first package, but does he have unity when the White House begins chipping away at some of these things? What's the real baseline that some of these members that are more on the right of the caucus, they want some sweeping change. What are they going to be willing to accept to get past this debt limit fight and say it was a victory? That, I think, is going to be the tougher call.
It probably is going to be the tougher call. But I would argue that, as Kate said earlier, if they would get even one or two of these priorities, it would be a significant victory, given where they are and where they only have one house of Congress. Obviously, if they'd had taken the Senate, they'd have stronger negotiating ability. They didn't. So they have a narrow margin in the House. You've got to be able to look at the balance of forces and see what's possible with those. And of course, the alternative, Kate, you're going to get the last word. The alternative is if they wouldn't accept something, some kind of compromise that doesn't get everything they've asked for, the alternative would be everything blowing up and they might get nothing at all.
Yeah, Paul. And I think there are some areas of, where they could even compromise a little bit and still get something important. I think permitting reform is the obvious one that they really should get because President Biden says he supports something ostensibly close to it, even though he doesn't. But I think they could get somewhere on that. I also think on work requirements, I mean, even if it were for the 4 million people on food stamps who are 18 to 59, able-bodied and have no children in the household, that would be a victory and an improvement for the economy. So there really are some places for compromise. And I hope, like McCarthy did today, Republicans will keep talking directly to the public to the extent possible and making this case if Biden and the press won't.
I'm a little less optimistic than you are, Kate, about the work requirements, just because I think the left is so hard over against them. But I think you're absolutely right. It is good politics, and Republicans should want to argue on those terms. All right, this is going to be a fascinating showdown here. We'll be in the news with increasing frequency and, how shall I say, frantic nature in the next couple of months. We'll be here to follow it all on Potomac Watch. We're here every day on Potomac Watch, so please check in tomorrow for another edition of the podcast. Thanks for listening.